Inside the deadliest prison gangs in the United States, the power they hold will shock you. Before this story disappears behind locked doors, hit subscribe, like, and comment, because what really controls America's prisons isn't written in the rulebook. The phone started ringing before the crime scene tape was even dry. It was a small apartment complex outside San Antonio, quiet enough that most neighbors slept through the flashing lights. Inside one unit, investigators found a man face down on the kitchen floor, no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle. What caught their attention wasn't what was missing, it was what was left behind. A handwritten note on the counter. 3 words, perfectly spelled. Not a threat, not a confession, a confirmation. Within hours, federal agents traced the message back to a maximum security prison nearly 300 miles away. The suspect connected to the apartment had been incarcerated for over a decade. No internet access, no legal calls that week, no approved visitors. Yet somehow, instructions had moved cleanly from inside a prison cell to the outside world. This wasn't a first. For years, federal investigations have documented how certain prison gangs operate with a level of organization that rivals street-based criminal enterprises. Groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and the Texas Syndicate didn't lose power when their leaders were locked up. In many cases, they refined it. Behind the walls, chaos is expensive. Order is profitable. Agent Elena Morales understood that better than most. Assigned to a joint task force tracking organized prison influence, she had spent years watching the same pattern repeat. Arrests on the street, convictions in court, celebrations in the media, and then, quietly, business resumed. Morales stood inside a federal monitoring room, staring at call charts pinned across the wall. Lines connected prisons to cities, inmates to intermediaries, seemingly unrelated crimes to the same invisible source. Each line represented a message that never mentioned a crime directly. Just routine language, familiar phrases, innocent conversations. To the untrained ear, it sounded harmless. To Morales, it sounded like command. Inside one California facility, a new inmate learned the system the hard way. He refused an offer of protection during intake, believing neutrality would keep him safe. No one argued. No one pressured him. He was allowed to make his choice. 3 days later, he requested an emergency transfer. Not because he'd been threatened, but because he'd been isolated, cut off from resources, denied access to informal systems every other inmate relied on to survive daily life. The message was clear: power didn't need violence to enforce obedience. It only needed patience. Federal court records show that prison gangs operate under strict internal codes. Membership isn't casual. Violations carry consequences. Orders aren't shouted, they're passed quietly through trusted layers. Leadership remains insulated, often serving life sentences that remove the urgency to rush. From inside, they manage disputes, assign responsibilities, and decide when silence is more effective than action. Morales reviewed transcripts from a wiretap authorized years earlier. In one call, a man spoke calmly about family matters, work schedules, and health concerns. At no point did he mention money, drugs, or retaliation. Yet, 2 weeks later, coordinated activity occurred across 3 states. The code was never broken. It was simply understood. The most disturbing discovery came from a declassified federal assessment compiled after decades of monitoring. It concluded that incarceration did not weaken these organizations. In some cases, it strengthened them by centralizing leadership and removing distractions. Prison wasn't a barrier. It was infrastructure. As Morales flipped through the report, one section stood out. It described how certain gangs intentionally avoided attention by preventing internal violence unless absolutely necessary. Less disruption meant fewer lockdowns. Fewer lockdowns meant more communication. More communication meant more control. The system adapted around them. Late that night, Morales received an update from Texas. A corrections officer had reported irregular behavior in a high-security unit. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts. Inmates refusing to speak. Others suddenly cooperating. Transfers requested in perfect sequence. Someone had issued instructions. The officer's report ended with a line Morales had seen before, buried in old case files from the 1990s. Hierarchy appears intact. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the realization settling in. These weren't gangs reacting to pressure. They were anticipating it. And somewhere inside the prison system, a decision had already been made, one that hadn't reached the streets yet, but soon would. Because when power moves quietly, the consequences rarely stay contained. And whatever was coming next had already been approved. By the time Agent Elena Morales arrived in Texas, the prisons had already adjusted. That was the first thing that unsettled her. No panic. No visible disruption. Just a subtle tightening of routines, like a machine correcting itself. Head counts were cleaner. Yard movements ran on time. Even disciplinary reports dropped. On paper, everything looked calmer than usual. Morales knew better. She met with Deputy Warden Thomas Reed, a man who had spent 25 years inside correctional facilities without ever fully trusting them. Reed didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a thin folder across the table. "Transfers," he said. "All requested within 48 hours of the San Antonio incident." Morales scanned the names. Different races. Different affiliations. Different security levels. "What do they have in common?" she asked. "They're all communicators," Reed replied. "Not leaders. Not muscle. The people who pass things along." Morales felt the tension rise. Removing communicators didn't dismantle a network. It protected it. Inside the units, the change was more pronounced. Inmates who had once been loud and defiant now kept their heads down. Others suddenly gained access to better jobs, cleaner cells, and informal protection. No paperwork explained it. No officer signed off. The rules were being enforced somewhere else. Morales requested historical cooperation agreements from the records archive. What she found was a web of sealed files, many marked inactive or superseded. Names appeared again and again, inmates who had testified years earlier, then disappeared into transfers, early releases, or witness programs that were never publicly acknowledged. One name stopped her cold. Luis Navarro. Navarro had been a mid-level figure connected to multiple gangs, not loyal to any one group. According to federal records, he had provided intelligence during a major investigation in the early 2000s. His cooperation was supposed to have collapsed several internal chains. Instead, those chains still existed. Morales tracked Navarro's last known placement to a federal medical facility. The file ended abruptly, stamped with a classification change and a single handwritten note, "Status revised." No explanation. When she asked Reed about it, he hesitated. "Navarro didn't disappear," he said carefully. "He was reabsorbed." Reabsorbed. The word echoed in her mind. Morales realized then that cooperation didn't always weaken prison gangs. Sometimes it strengthened them by exposing vulnerabilities, who talked, who didn't, and how pressure was applied. The organizations learned from every investigation, every indictment. They adapted faster than policy ever could. That adaptation became visible when a corrections officer named Rachel Kim came forward. Kim had noticed patterns in mail distribution that didn't match official logs. Certain inmates always received letters on the same day, even when they came from different facilities. The envelopes looked ordinary. The messages inside were mundane. But the timing was precise. Morales reviewed months of mail records and saw it clearly. Communication wasn't flowing randomly. It moved in pulses, coordinated across institutions. When one channel went quiet, another picked up the rhythm. The system had redundancy. Then Kim made a mistake. She flagged the irregularities in a report that went higher than it should have. 2 days later, she was reassigned without explanation. Her access privileges were reduced. Her name quietly disappeared from internal distribution lists. She didn't violate policy, Reed said. She violated expectation. Morales understood. The gangs weren't the only ones maintaining order. There were people inside the system who preferred predictability over disruption. Gang governance reduced chaos. Reduced chaos made facilities easier to manage. That was the unspoken bargain. Morales received another update, this time from California. A sealed informant had recanted testimony without explanation. Surveillance requests were delayed. Warrants stalled. The investigation wasn't being blocked directly. It was being slowed. Late one night, Morales sat alone in a conference room, staring at a wall covered in timelines. Everything pointed to a single conclusion: the gangs weren't reacting to law enforcement pressure anymore. They were setting boundaries. The most chilling evidence arrived just before dawn. A monitored call from a high-security unit had slipped through review because it appeared routine. Two men discussed weather patterns, family health, and work schedules. At the end of the call, one of them paused and said calmly, "Everything's aligned." Within hours, inmate movement stabilized across 3 states. Transfers stopped. Tension dropped. Whatever decision had been pending was finalized. Morales closed the file slowly. She wasn't chasing criminals anymore. She was watching a system negotiate with itself. And in that negotiation, someone had decided which truths could surface, and which ones would never leave the prison walls. The first thing Agent Elena Morales noticed when the warrants finally came through was how late they were. Not denied. Not rejected. Just delayed long enough for something else to finish moving. By the time federal teams executed coordinated searches across 3 states, the targets were already clean. Phones wiped. Ledgers missing. Safe houses abandoned. It was as if someone had read the playbook in advance and calmly removed every loose end. Inside the prisons, the response was even quieter. No riots. No lockdowns. No retaliation. Just order. Morales stood inside a federal command center watching live feeds from multiple facilities. Yard movements were smooth. Head counts matched perfectly. Inmates followed instructions with almost unsettling precision. To an administrator, it looked like success. To Morales, it looked like control. She met one last time with Deputy Warden Reed, who had grown noticeably thinner since the investigation began. He didn't sit down. "You won't find a kingpin," he said. "You won't find a final order." "Why?" Morales asked. "Because this isn't leadership anymore," Reed replied. "It's consensus." That was the moment it clicked. The gangs hadn't survived decades of crackdowns by relying on single leaders. They survived by embedding themselves into the routines of prison life. Just protection. Dispute resolution. When leadership was removed, the structure remained. When communication was cut, alternatives appeared. Power had become decentralized, and therefore harder to destroy. Morales reviewed the last batch of declassified documents released under pressure from oversight committees. They confirmed what investigators had long suspected but never said publicly: prison gangs had evolved into governance systems. They enforced rules internally, reduced random violence, and punished unpredictability. In some facilities, administrators had quietly learned that disrupting those systems created chaos they couldn't control. So the system adapted. The final revelation came from an unexpected place. A sealed court transcript from a case 20 years earlier, overlooked because it never went to trial. An inmate had testified under oath about a meeting held inside a prison law library. Representatives from rival gangs had been present. No threats. No arguments. Just negotiation. The topic wasn't crime. It was stability. They discussed boundaries, communication channels, and enforcement protocols. The goal wasn't dominance. It was continuity. As long as the internal rules were respected, violence stayed low. As long as violence stayed low, attention stayed away. The transcript ended with a line that sent a chill through Morales. Order benefits everyone, including the institution meant to contain them. Morales took the findings to her superiors. The response was careful, measured. Commendations were offered. Recommendations were noted. And then, quietly, the task force was reassigned. Not shut down. Redirected. Official statements praised progress and cited ongoing reforms. No gang names were mentioned. No structures were exposed. The public narrative focused on individual cases, not systems. Morales understood the compromise being made. You could dismantle pieces. You could arrest messengers. You could disrupt flows. But tearing out the foundation would mean admitting how long it had been allowed to stand. Weeks later, Morales received a final update from Texas. The corrections officer who had first reported irregularities, the one whose report triggered the chain of events, had resigned. No explanation. No exit interview. Her personnel file was marked complete. At the bottom of the file was a handwritten note added by an unknown administrator. Balance maintained. Morales stared at the words, recognizing them immediately. The same language she had seen in intercepted calls. The same phrasing used inside the gangs themselves. The boundaries had blurred. That night, Morales walked past a federal detention center as lights dimmed for evening count. Rows of windows glowed briefly, then went dark in perfect sequence. Somewhere inside, rules were being followed. Orders respected. Lines not crossed. Not because of fear. Because of structure. She realized then that the most shocking truth wasn't how powerful prison gangs were. It was how indispensable they had become to the system that claimed to oppose them. The power didn't come from violence. It came from patience. From organization. From understanding that control didn't need chaos to thrive. As Morales turned away, her phone buzzed with a notification from an internal channel she no longer officially monitored. One line of text. Everything's still aligned. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some truths, once uncovered, aren't meant to be resolved, only managed. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.